is how little things matter. And I'm so glad it is, because we all know little things matter, yet we pay so little attention to them. Little thing always reminds me of a story my wife has always told me. She first told me when we were getting married. This is about a husband and wife who just got married. And the husband says, my wife looks after the little things. She looks after how we can get money to buy a house, a mortgage, how we're going to educate our children, how we shall deal with our household, make sure we have a very fulfilled life. I manage the big things, like what should be the interest rate, whether taxation should be increased, whether we should spend more money on the environment, how fast the economy is growing, that sort of thing. Now, at this stage, I don't know if you're laughing, you're supposed to fall about laughing. The reason is that the little things that the wife handles is actually the big things for the couple. And the big things that the husband says he's going to handle is beyond his competence, is beyond his pay grade. He's not the governor of the bank to decide what the interest rate is. He's not the Chancellor of the Exchequer or the Finance Minister to decide what the taxation will be or what the GDP will be and things like that. Yet it is the little things in life that the wife, he says, is in control of that is really important. Now, I think we sometimes forget about these little things. We ignore them. We think they are not important. We don't pay much attention to them. For instance, take this very little thing of being polite to people. Now, I've lived in Britain for half a century, and one of the first things I learned when I came to this country is how important two words are: please and thank you. You've always got to say that. There's another important word that the British use, sorry. They're always saying sorry, even if they don't always mean that they're sorry. But nevertheless, let's look at please and thank you. So, for instance, if somebody asks you whether you want a cup of coffee, and you say yes, you're supposed to say yes, please, not just yes, because if you just say yes, they'll correct you and say yes, please. Or if somebody says you want a cup of coffee and you say no, you can't just say no. You've got to say no, thank you. Otherwise, they'll get upset. Now, when I came to this country in 1969, which was a long time ago, I didn't know all this, because in India, we don't tend to say that. I don't know whether India has changed now and whether you in Bangalore, by the way, why do you call it Bangalore? It should be Bangalore. But anyway, I used to call it Bangalore when I first went there all those years ago. But the point is, I wasn't brought up in that. Although I grew up in Mumbai and I consider Mumbai my hometown and I can speak Marathi. I used to come first in Marathi in school, may I say. I am from Bengal. My parents are from what is now Bangladesh, and they considered Calcutta their home. I never did. And so I speak Bengali. And of course, in Bengali, the thank you word is dhanyabad, but you'll find very few people saying dhanyabad if you ask them whether they want a cup of tea or coffee. In fact, it's a bit of a joke term. And in India, it was very common for me growing up to find the shopkeeper in any shop that I'd gone. If they were going to give me change, they would bounce the change in front of me. If I did that in this country, I tell you, I would be in a lot of trouble. Yet, and there is another little thing in India which is so different to little things here. And let me tell you a story about my family. This goes back to 1953. It shows how old I am. We were having a family photograph. And in those days, this is long before iPhones and, selfies that you could take and things like that. You went to a studio. So my parents and my father had arranged for us to go to a studio. However, the day we were supposed to go to the studio, a friend of my father's, and we had been a guest of his at his place in Matharan, which is a hill station near Mumbai, arrived. And my father thought he couldn't not ask him to come along. So that's the only photograph I have of my family. My mother, my father, my two sisters, and me also has a photograph of this man standing behind. And now I have this photograph in my hall in the house in Shepherd's Bush that I share with my wife. And my English friends come and look at it, and I very proudly display the photograph, and I say, this is from my childhood. It shows me wearing a tie and, you know, properly dressed up and so on and so forth. My sisters are in frocks, my father in a suit, my mother in a sari and all that. And they look at it and they admire it. And then they say, talk with the man behind, and they say, oh, he must have been your uncle. And when I tell them, no, he was a certain Mr. Das, who was a family friend who happened to be there that day. And out of good manners, one of those little things, my father thought he could not be part of the photograph. They are absolutely amazed, because that is something you just wouldn't do in this country. It is impossible. Now, for instance, and let me give you another example of a little thing that Indians do, which I find very, very touching. Now, the technical man who's organizing this talk, you probably don't know, is a man called Shardul Garg, who's been in touch with me, wonderful man, and he's addressed me as sir. And nobody in this country, and I've lived here, as I said, for 50 years, would ever address me as sir. They would think it demeaning for themselves to call me sir. But he addresses me as sir as a mark of respect. You know, I suppose he thinks I'm old enough to be a sir. And when I was growing up in India, I always touched the feet of people who came to our house. I was encouraged, in fact, obligated. It was mandatory to call them uncle or aunt, depending on whether they were male or female, and to touch their feet. Now, in this country, when I tell my English friends that, they are absolutely appalled. Absolutely. For them, what for me, when I was growing up, was a very simple gesture, which meant a lot, which meant respect, which meant that I was showing the right amount of courtesy and kindness to friends of my parents, would here be completely demeaning and totally unacceptable. But I suppose the best examples of little things that I can provide is from the great men who helped India win freedom. Let's take Mahatma Gandhi, father of the nation. Now let me go back to 1931. India is in the middle of trying to get freedom from Britain. Britain doesn't want to give India freedom, doesn't believe the Indians can rule themselves. Gandhi and the Congress Party have decided that if the British don't give at least Dominion status, which is what they had given to their white colonies like Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and South Africa, the whites were believed to be the only people who could manage their own affairs, then Gandhi would launch a civil disobedience campaign. Now, Gandhi does one thing. He writes a letter to the Viceroy. This is what he always did. Before he started any campaign, he would write a letter to the Viceroy saying, if you do this, I won't start the campaign. But if you don't, I'll start the campaign. And you know what the letter said? The letter did not have a single word about freedom, about Dominion status, about the British leaving India, nothing like that. The letter said, remove the tax on salt, have prohibition. And, you know, there was Subhash Bose, a great freedom fighter who wanted the British out of India, who eventually, as we know, left India to raise an army to fight the British during the Second World War. He was appalled. He said, what is this letter that Gandhiji has written? Where is the talk of that if you freely make salt, they would understand the iniquity of foreign rule? And he followed this up with another, what looks like a very, very simple step. He said, I'm going to go to the seashore from my ashram in near Ahmedabad, Sabarmati, and I'm going to make salt. But he didn't just get into a car or a train and go there. He walked. And remember, this is long before anybody thought of 24-hour television, let alone Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or anything. And as he walked, he made the people of the world aware. Newsreel cameras came along, aware of what India was going through. And then he went to the beach near Dandi, and I've been there. It's a very moving place. And he picked up some sand from the sea and so on, and made salt. And that gesture started what was the most decisive civil disobedience campaign in the history of the freedom movement. And he recognized how this thing can work. Or let's take another little step that he took. One of the first things he did after he came back from South Africa was he discarded all his Western clothes and he wore a loincloth. And he wore the sort of dress that, as Winston Churchill, making fun of him, said is what a fakir in India wears: a loincloth and a simple piece of dhoti round him. But in making that gesture, he was saying, I represent India. And it was in this dress that he went to see the Viceroy, Lord Halifax, climbing up the Viceregal steps. The Viceregal steps were the grand thing. Britain had built New Delhi, the place that would last them for 1,000 years. So they thought their empire would last 1,000 years. And here was this man representing real India, not the India of suits and elaborate clothes, but the India that represented the masses. And that had an enormous impact. Very little thing. And, you know, it's very interesting. Soon after that, he came to England and met the king. And he went in the same dress to meet the king. And he was asked by the British newspapers that, you know, aren't you underdressed? He said, the king dressed for me and for himself. The king was dressed in +4s. I was dressed in -4s. You know, Gandhi understood what simple gestures can mean, what the impact it can be on the world. So, for instance, when Gandhi met whoever he met them sitting on the floor in his ashram, wherever that was. And in 1942, Sir Strafford Cripps went to India to try and see if you could get the British Raj and the Congress Party together. They were at loggerheads because the British had declared war and had said nothing about giving India freedom. And when he went to meet Gandhi, he took his shoes off and sat down on the floor. And that gesture, simple gesture, if you might think, caused absolute horror in Britain. The king's private secretary wrote in his diary that this is terrible. How could he do that? It is so demeaning. And yet that gesture meant it had an enormous impact. It had created ripple waves of what India represented to that extent, in the sense Gandhi was saying, I am a human being. I am the equal of you. If you come into my house wearing shoes and I require you to take off your shoes, you have to do that. And may I say, in Indian homes, both in India and in this country, people are required to take off shoes. A very simple thing, but people have to follow that. And these are simple gestures. It's very interesting. About a couple of years ago, Prince William, who will one day become King of England, and his wife, the Duchess of Cambridge, went to Pakistan. It was very interesting that the Duchess of Cambridge had a headgear covering her head in the way Muslim women do. And that was actually praised in England compared to what had happened to Stafford Cripps when he met Gandhi. That was praised as a sign that the Duchess, future Queen of England, understood Muslim feelings about how women should dress. And that is where the change has come. That is where, if you like, the importance of simple little things have made a huge impact. How you dress, how you address people, how you talk has enormous and big impact. Let me give you another a little thing from history. Lord Mountbatten arrives in India after the war. He's been told by Clement Attlee, the British Prime Minister, that we have to leave India. We can't hold on to India. And he meets Jawaharlal Nehru, one of our great leaders, India's first Prime Minister. And you know, one of the things he tells Nehru, well, you know, you can always come and have a swim at the Viceregal Palace. And that was the first time anybody had made that gesture to Nehru, that he liked to have a swim. And the Viceregal Palace, which is now, of course, Rashtrapati Bhavan, has a wonderful swimming pool. And that formed a bond between the two. And that is the sort of simple gestures that we often forget to make. We think of the big things and we forget what the simple things are. And history is full of, let me say, simple things going wrong and being quite disastrous. And let me give you a story from the Indian past. This is the kingdom of Vijayanagara. Vijayanagaram, a great historic kingdom, a great Hindu kingdom, and surrounded by Muslim rulers who wanted to destroy it. But the Muslim rulers themselves were fighting each other, and the kings and the rulers of Vijayanagar combined with one Muslim ruler to fight another one. And they had one of these battles, they won. At the end of it, after victory, there was the victory banquet. But the then ruler of Vijayanagara did not attend the banquet. He didn't want to eat with the Muslims. And what happened? These Muslims were very offended. Very simple gesture after a battle. And they said, no, this man has to be removed. And all these Muslim kingdoms which surrounded Vijayanagara, which had been fighting each other, combined and destroyed Vijayanagara. Again, now I'm not saying had this ruler gone and had broken bread with his Muslim allies, that Vijayanagara wouldn't have been attacked by an alliance of all the Muslim rulers. But what I'm saying is that gesture, that little thing did not go down very well. And throughout history, you see that people make, impulsively sometimes forget that the little things that they do are they forget what the import of those little things are, how those little things add up. And our life is filled with that. And of course, as we become more technologically adept, as we become more technologically savvy, these little things have an enormous impact. I'm talking to you in a background in England where there has been enormous publicity about racism in cricket. Started with Yorkshire cricket. Those were the first allegations that were made, and it has gone on. And many of these allegations are about simple little things of behavior, of how people addressed each other without knowing what those words meant, without knowing what those words signified at times. I'm always hesitant to call people racist, out and out racist, or institutional racism, because that is a very big charge to make. I think very often it is because people don't understand how sensitive other people can be about the way you address them, about the way you talk to them, about the way you make them feel part of their lives. And perhaps the biggest example of little things is the story of Yudhishthira at the end of Mahabharata. For me, Yudhishthira is the perfect human being. He's the greatest figure in mythology that I know of. And what's the story about Yudhishthira? Yudhishthira is walking, and there's a dog. And he cares for this dog. And then there is a voice saying, you must discard this dog. And he refuses to discard the dog. And what happens? This dog turns out to be God. So, there was this man who was prepared to give up heaven for a dog, but actually it was a test that the gods had put on him. And now I'm not saying these gods put tests on us, but if we don't look at ourselves and think of the other individual, how are we affecting them? How do we relate to them? Not in the big things of whether we are managing their lives, but in the little things of how we address them, how we talk to them, how we entertain them. Then at the end of it, I think our lives can be decisively and very, very damagingly affected. And that is, I think, the message of looking after little things right from the beginning of, the wife looking after little things of managing the house, and the husband thinking he can manage interest rates, to Gandhi writing to the Viceroy, not about freedom, but about making salt. A very simple thing. Thank you very much.